Welcome to this webinar organized by The Elephant in partnership with the Heinrich-Böll Foundation. My name is Mishai Mwangola. I'm a member of the Elephant Herd. I like to think of myself as one of the herd matriarchs. But on a serious note, The Elephant, as many of you know, is an intellectual platform, particularly invested in the reimagining of our world from our standpoint as Africans, and in this case, specifically as Kenyans. And this is the fourth and final webinar in our series exploring the BBI judgment delivered in May, so that we can better understand not just the judgment, but also its implications for Kenya and for us as Kenyans. In our first webinar, we really delved into the legal aspects of the case. That is, in the words, if I may quote Waikwa Wanyoike, who was on that panel, but that is the most important court judgment we have seen in recent years, perhaps even in our history, maybe even more important than the famous Maraga judgment that vacated the first presidential election in 2017. And if you're interested in those legal aspects, please catch that first webinar. In the second webinar, we explored the question of inclusivity that is at the heart of what the Building Bridges initiative seeks to address. And in particular, we examined how, if they do, the BBI proposals respond to the real issues confronting marginal and marginalized communities, such as the youth. And then in the final conversation, we looked at the politics of the Building Bridges initiative and really explored the role of specific actors, especially political actors, but also civil society actors. And all of these discussions can be found at the Elephant Archives. You can find all three. This one will also be put up there when we are done at www.theelephantinfo and on our YouTube account. And I believe that they're also being archived on the Heinrich-Böll Foundation's website. So we're going to have 1 hour of discussion among members of the panel, and then we will come to questions and comments. And I encourage you, if you have questions as we go along, please start putting them up already, and then we will come to them in that 1 hour. It is easier if you put your questions in the Q&A, because that makes it just easier to see them. I'm sure we'll have a very vibrant discussion if the last 3 discussions was anything to go by in the chat. So please put your questions in the Q&A. I will privilege questions, but if we have time later on, the questions that are written, but if we have time after we've done with all of those, perhaps we'll also get an opportunity to have a live discussion. So don't wait for that mark, just start putting in your questions. So we are having this conversation on the cusp of the appeal ruling, which will be delivered tomorrow. Hopefully by this time tomorrow, we will know, Friday, the 20th of August. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of discussion after that on the BBI, on the judgment, on the appeal ruling. So we thought that for this final conversation, it would be an excellent time to just pause and also ask, hold on, what is this all about? Why is there a Building Bridges initiative? What is it seeking to address? Why does it matter how the court rules? In fact, should it matter? What are the implications of the ruling, and how does it affect us on an everyday? As Kenyans like to ask, how will it put food on my table? So to help me answer these questions, I am joined by 2 great minds already, and we're hoping that the third person will be able to join us. And these are all people I just love thinking about with. Each of them has gifted me time and time again with an invitation to think deeply and differently about issues that I think are deeply important to who we are as Kenyans. And so for me, it is such a privilege to hold the space as they extend that gift to all of us who are in this conversation together. I want to start by introducing Oyunga Pala. Oyunga is a Kenyan writer. I guess he's best known for his newspaper columns, his blog, all of which have examined the texture of everyday Kenyan life and the challenges of modernity and disillusionment. Oyunga is also, if I may say it this way, a member of the Elephant Herd. He's been a curator for us, and I'm really looking forward to having him on. Oyunga, karibu sana.
Thank you very much, Mishai. Yeah.
We're also joined by Wandia Joya. Wandia is another matriarch in the Elephant Herd. She's a public intellectual who engages as a teacher and researcher, both in the academy and in the public sphere. Wandia is invested in Pan-Africanism. And so I know a lot of these questions she looks at, not just in terms of how it affects us as Kenyans, but really what are the implications for all of us, no matter where we are on the African continent and beyond. I know she's invested in history, as well as in the relationship between the world of ideas and the world of everyday lived experience. Wandia tells me her mentors and icons are people like Frantz Fanon, Michel Mugo, Nikki Giovanni, Lewis B. Gordon, and Paul Tiamba Zeleza. So I'm looking forward to hearing all those great minds join us as well in this conversation as we proceed. We are also looking forward to be joined. I know he's been held up, but maybe I'm really hoping that we will be joined by, and I'm going to really enjoy saying Dr. Gala Chome. Gala is a writer and a historian who recently completed his doctoral studies, and we're all very excited about that. And his work examines the modern political history of the Kenyan coast. Gala has written on the politics of elections, development, devolution, and religion. And indeed, he was one of the panelists that joined us when we talked about BBI and the question of inclusivity, particularly looking at what that means for the youth. So, as I was thinking about this panel, and I'm going to just go straight into it, I was struck by a piece that is currently up on the Elephant, written by Antoinette Kankindi, in which what she says, and I'm going to quote directly from this piece, Dr. Kankindi suggests to us that, and I quote, rethinking the country as a nation is legitimate for Kenya and Africa. The question of which philosophical direction to take is the basis of rethinking the country as a nation. What is it for? What are the foundations that have been lacking? It is a question of the state as a polity and its purpose, which must touch its foundations. And then citing Anyang Nyong, Roger Scruton, and Alan Patton, she suggests that all this indicates that a way of rebuilding the basis of the nation must be found, because only then can the formation of loyalty and service for each other, neighbors and strangers alike, that is necessary to the existing of a functioning state takes place. For me, what Antoinette Kankindi is suggesting is that, first of all, when we talk about the country of Kenya and we talk about the nation of Kenya, we're not talking about the same thing. And then she also suggests to me that the state is also not a synonym for those two. And so as we go into this question, this whole thinking about what a nation is, what a state is, what does the soul of the nation is, what do we mean by that? I'm just going to throw this out and ask both of you to just start us off by responding before we go into, let's leave the soul thing, first of all, on the side. What is a nation and what is a country? What's the difference? Oyunga, Wandia, am I and Antoinette going into a whole different space? Is there a difference? I know we're a country. Are we a nation? Oyunga, let me start with you.
Yeah, I mean, Antoinette, obviously, I think she wrote a really powerful article, it's a very profound piece, if I could just say it in a word. And it made me really think, because now, for the longest time, especially when you live outside of Kenya, one of the first things that people always ask is, where do you come from? And you mention your country, right? And there's a certain pride about being from a certain country, especially as a Kenyan during the time of Olympics, with people like Eliud Kipchoge doing what they're doing. There's a certain pride that comes with that sense of nationalism. But when people ask you about your nation, as in what are the shared values, and you look at perhaps other Africans, other Kenyans in the diaspora, and you find that in terms of the kind of values that you wish to be associated with, are sometimes not always from your countrymen. Yeah? And you find that in a space of, say, in a diasporic space, you find that you start getting attracted to people who sort of share your own values, and you realize when you look critically at your nation, you realize it doesn't quite hold some of the values that you wish to espouse. So I've learned to sort of create the distinction that for me, I look at a nation as a very sort of recent entity and always a work in progress. And I tend to think of a country as more of a geographical location, the place from which we emerged. Yeah, that's the kind of distinction I create. Yeah.
Mm. Thank you very much, Oyunga. That's useful. Wandia, again, the same question as a basis of beginning to think about this. Would you agree? Would you disagree? Would you add, is there a difference between a country and a nation for you?
I think I would make the same distinction that Oyunga made. Maybe just add that when it comes to nation, a nation is what we decide it is. It's a decision we make. And it's a decision we make through the values that we espouse, the interests that we have, and it has to be something that we keep affirming through ritual, through culture, through institutions. So it is something that we have to agree on and that we have to commit ourselves to keep renewing. The problem with Kenya is that I think there's a sense in which as people, ordinary people, there's a sense in which we share a lot. We share, cultural expressions like weddings, initiation. We love one another. We invite people into our homes. I think at that basic African level, we are a nation as Kenyans. We celebrate, for example, our athletes. But the state keeps interfering with those relationships and keeps distracting us, poisoning our relationships. So we lose sense of what really matters, and we tend to lose our ability to care for one another, so that whatever happens in one aspect of the geographical area, which I think is the country, that we are responsible for. Whatever happens in one side of Kenya, we don't really act politically in solidarity with them. So I would say that that's the distinction is the decision that we make and the commitment that we make through cultural expressions. That's what makes a nation. And I think it's something we have to be more deliberate about if that's what we want. Because, we could not want to be a Kenyan nation, and that's fine. But whatever we want, I think we have to be more deliberate about it and not let politicians whose interest is material and not human, we should not let them dictate what it means to be a nation.
Thank you, Wandia. I want to welcome Gala. Gala, again, I've already introduced you, but I did want to say it's the first time I've seen you since you completed your doctorate. And while titles really are just something else that we add, I do recognize the investment of time. We've had so many conversations. So I just have to say congratulations, my brother, and welcome. And I want to extend that question to you. I know you've done a lot of work on this. So first of all, karibu.
Asante.
And then we're thinking about the nation as opposed to the country. And, I'm hearing Gala, that Wandia and Oyunga are suggesting that they don't necessarily mean the same thing. Wandia is now provoking me to think, is it possible that we might say, you know what, let's not bother about the nation. Let's just have a country that works. So what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So thank you for having me. So in strict political science language, the distinction is usually made between the state and the nation, right? And therefore, the nation usually describing or referring to the community that could either, in terms of territory, be found within the boundaries of a state, in this case a country, or could even span the boundaries of a state as that exists as a legal entity, right? So nation is more, the word nation describes the community. It refers more to the people. It refers more to their histories. It refers more to their culture. And a nation can exist without a state. And that is actually why those two concepts are seen as different. Now, state, of course, is in this case sort of a Western creation, particularly 1498 with the Treaty of Westphalia, where this kind of modern state system is agreed to, and it exists in the international relations as a legal unit. It may actually contain many different nations within one state, and I think that this is the sort of I don't want to see it as a problem, but it has been described. It has been described as a problem when it comes to African politics. That you have states that were created by an inorganic colonial process that did not pay attention to sort of historical, cultural continuities within the continent. So that's how you find in most African states composed by different communities, different cultures, different languages. And that then becomes, as a historian of African history, Basil Davidson calls the curse of the African state. Now, then the question becomes, and I think Wandia has posed the question very well, do we want to become a state? Do you want to become a nation? It's very clear that Kenya is a state. It exists in the international universe as a legal entity. But it's not very clear whether we can talk of a Kenyan nation. So the question is that a problem? And if it's a problem, why? And if it's not a problem, then what's the problem, right? With our politics, we are so used to thinking of what we call tribalism as sort of at the center of our country's politics. But if we were a nation, would we have solved many other problems that have affected our history? So if we did have a Kenyan nation, are we saying that would be equal to lack of corruption, lack of inequality, a country that is full of patriotic citizens? Is that what we are saying? I don't think these two things usually go together. However, in the political space, the way politicians talk about the importance of having a nation, it is always presented as the cure-all solution to most of the problems that bedevil our country's politics. So I want to start off with kind of posing those series of questions to take us through the discussion.
And indeed, Gala, one of the things I really want to get to those questions to ask, so as I said earlier, how does this help us put food on our table? What's the relationship between this? But before we go there, I just want to pick up on something that all three of you have said, that a nation is about the people. The country is about, the space, the land, where we all are. We are all in an entity that we imagine, those people on the other side of this entity, of this geographical space that are governed by the same state, we somehow are related. And one question is, perhaps we don't want to be a nation. Perhaps we want to be, if you want, a federation of several ethnic nations or other kinds of nations that are all under one state. And some people have argued that that's what BBI is trying to do, is to say, listen, let's accept that we are different nations, and then let's have representatives of those nations negotiate over the state. And then the rest of us hopefully will get the benefits of it. So I want to ask, and I'm really, really invested, probably, and it's one of my favorite articles in the Constitution tells us that culture is the foundation of the nation. This is something we have agreed on. We as Kenyans have agreed on, that the foundation of this nation is about culture. And culture is, of course, about people. So I want to think about what it means when we talk about people and we talk about the state is about, these frameworks that, deliver to the people. The country is this geographical space. The nation seems to be something a little bit more intangible. And I want to suggest that when we talk about the soul of the nation, that's what we are talking about. And that's really hard to pin down, to define. So I'm going to, again, ask all three of you. I'm going to start with Wandia, because Wandia, I know you talk a lot about this thing called the soul. What does it mean to you when we talk about the soul of the nation? And then I'll come to Oyunga and Gala, so we just define our terms before we talk about what does this actually mean to all of us. Wandia, please.
Whoa, I should have gone last. For me, I feel our nation does not have a soul. The way we've defined Kenya and the way we have let the politicians manipulate our definition of Kenya, that definition has no soul. So what we are struggling for is actually a soul, and not even just the soul of Kenya, but the soul of being human beings and being Africans. And what our soul does is that it puts away the intangibles that you just mentioned, and it says, who are we and what's our bottom line? What are the things that we must do no matter what? You know, for me, care is one of them, that we must care for one another. Whatever happens in Garissa, in Narok, in Pokot, in Kwale, all those things should matter to us. And we should care about them as if it was our next door neighbor or our family. To me, that's soul, and that's what we don't have. That's what we are struggling so hard for. And I think, at least I would think, that the devolution was part of that. It was to say everybody in Kenya should be participating equally in their destiny, in the decisions that they make where they are, because we care. We care for everybody. And it's not to say I keep for myself, but it's to say we all take care of ourselves and take care of each other. I think that's the soul that we don't have and that we are still struggling for. I think there's a kernel in Kenyans. There's a small seed in Kenyans that is, you know, drowned by the noise of the political class and the state. And so I think what we are struggling for actually is our soul. We are trying to be human within these boundaries, but we are coming up against a lot of struggle and a lot of pushback. And I think that's what the BBI was about. I just also want to say that the other struggle that we have as human beings, especially since colonial rule, is the struggle to be social. You know, we were isolated and atomized into tribes. And the way tribes are spoken about in Kenya, it is not that this is an ethnic group on its own and it should be on its own. What those tribes do, from the definition of BBI, is to freeze us in time, so that whatever I do as an individual should not have any political or social impact beyond the self. And so what the BBI was trying to do is to atomize tribes, actually. They were not trying to say, let's have an ethnic federation. They were saying, let's atomize the tribes so that they don't talk to each other. And then the politicians, who I don't even know how they were appointed by money, capital, I don't know who appointed them. Then the politicians who get appointed, then they become our unelected representatives, kind of like kings. So they were not looking for an ethnic federation, even though that's what they were saying. They were trying to atomize us and separate us so that we are not politically and socially significant. And that has been the struggle of Africa since colonial times, to be able to have a voice that matters beyond ourselves and to be able to care for people who beyond us, beyond our immediate families. That's, to me, one of the basic struggles we have right now.
I really like what you said about care, because again, as we said, care is about who I imagine to be human like me and who I imagine I have a responsibility towards, so that even if it means that my interests, I have to now begin to negotiate, giving up some of my own privileges or my own, in the interest of somebody like me who I have embraced as being part of my community, I am okay with that. And somehow there is this discussion on as to whether what BBI is telling us, as you have said, is that there are only certain people you can entrust to care for you. And they must all have a share of the cake. You can't do it for yourself. And if I can send my representative there to negotiate with the state, I will be cared for. Otherwise, I cannot trust other people to care for me, and I should not have to care for the others. Thank you, Wandia. You said that you needed to think, but you've done very well, and always feel free to come back. May I come to Oyunga Ongala, who would like to go next?
I suppose
You can go ahead.
I'll go for Ngala. Yeah. So, so I mean, I'll just pick up on what Wandia said. Off the back of a soul, and then looking at Kenya, and I'll sort of lean back into my frames, and I kind of look at this through a very anthropological way, and then skew towards a bit of masculinity, and it sort of sets me in the family unit. So I tend to think of a nation or a country from within the context of a family, and it's not that Kenya in itself doesn't have a soul, but it's what has happened to our soul. And so then I introduced the issue now of trauma. And I think part of our problem, and I follow Wandia's critique on education, and lately I noticed she's been talking about almost what you describe as a traumaphobic society, is that we refuse to just basically speak about our trauma. And we've got into this sort of very habitual pattern of depressing our traumas. And so it's like about pile and pile. And if there's ever a PhD higher, higher and higher and deeper, or we just become experts at, and we even have a phrase for it, accepting and moving on, right? It's just become sort of like almost a national way of being, in a way in which we have adapted our behavior in how we escape our own traumas. And so when you return trauma back into the sort of like the family unit, what happens when a child is traumatized, and what happens to their soul? So what they do is that they create a sense of behaviors, a new set of adaptations that deal with the sense of loss. And those behaviors could manifest as perhaps as addictions or excesses, or perhaps what we'd call bad citizens or bad behavior. And the nature then of the state, who then in this case represents sort of our sense of a parental figure, is to correct the behavior. And they only know one way. And Wandia talks about this at great length in terms of how the educational system is structured. It is to punish. It is basically, that is the only thing we know, is that there's a certain set of behaviors supposed to follow. And if you don't follow it, we're going to punish. And it's going to be pain upon pain. And so there's really no way out of it. So when we come back to the issue of Kenya's soul, or the soul of the nation, is that we really need to start talking about our own traumas and identifying them and literally poking into them in order to sort of get beyond them. And I think this is where we start, because we're very good at adapting to go beyond something. I think, and one of the perfect examples is that when you have generational conversations, those of us, for example, who went through the boarding school generation where bullying was a rite of passage almost, you came into Form 1, you got sorted, and by the time you got into Form 3, and that was a whole ritual. That was the way it supposedly hardened up. If you came up from families where it was quite normal for the bell to be reached out for a sleeper to come out, for things to be flung, that was ordinary violence. There was nothing unusual about it. So what happens to us then as parents is that since we didn't deal with those traumas, when our kids come to us, perhaps we know, okay, we're not supposed to apply violence, but a kid is coming for us with a very sort of emotional attachment need, and we're completely unable to give that because we never had it. So what do? We create another sense of adaptation, which creates even more separation, which is why now you see the separation between generations. When you look at the generation, I guess that would be I like to call the generation, the millennials and the Generation Zs compared with the X, which would be my generation, is we're completely at loss. We're unable to talk to each other. The relationship is completely broken. And so I think culturally, and this is what I think Kamkindi sort of captures beautifully in an article by referencing Peyton, the idea that, yes, colonialism broke us. It broke the tribe. And in many ways, the tribe, for all its complications, was a functioning moral system, right? And that's broken. And there are many ways in which we can never repair it, right? Because we, in a way, we have almost been reprogrammed in ways that are quite deep. However, if you reduce it back to the family unit, to the actual house, is that when your house is broken, the tragedy is not so much of the loss. The tragedy is the inability to try and even repair it. And I think that is where culturally, at least as from those of us who come from the artistic bend, for me, I think that becomes our core mission and core responsibility, to be able to examine, to first of all come to the realization that we're dealing with a nation that's basically traumatized deeply at every level, at different levels, to the point of, even if you really want to understand trauma in our country, just look at our politicians, a complete addiction to power and success. Right? It's a very temporary addiction. It provides a very temporary relief, returns into a cycle of pain, but they cannot come out of that cycle. And so if you don't understand what the trauma is and how it's passed down, where, you ask yourselves, why would a policeman brutalize to the point of death somebody for not wearing a mask? The easiest thing is just the police are evil, police are bad. But if you move away from that outrage and that sense of enragement, you ask yourself, what kind of pain is that man in, to the point that just the very fact that a mask is displaced provokes that sort of anger? What kind of trauma did that policeman go through to express this kind of trauma repeatedly over and over and over again? What kind of pain is, the question is not so much why do police beat, is that how does this institution exist that this is the only way to cope with this problem? And those are kind of the questions we have to sort of start asking quite deeply, and in sort of very artistic ways, in terms of the kind of stories we tell about ourselves. Because if we don't, we continue to perpetuate, and we're in a complete inability to help those who come after us. So what happens to our children? And this is what we used to say about the Walambese culture. It's a complete disassociation. And we fixate on the behavior, that these kids are behaving bad. But as any parent knows, there's no such thing as a bad child. If you tell a child not to do something and they keep on repeating the same thing over and over again, who has the learning problem? You or the child? Because the child is acting out in a way, the actual word itself, acting out, is because they're unable to verbalize what they're feeling, so they act it out. So if we, on the other side, from the point of authority, are inability to understand what is happening, what do? There's a relationship breakdown. The ways in which we can, one solution, and I think this is where Concludi gets it right, is that in culture, there is stories. And we can retell the stories about ourselves, and in that, we can start actually mending our souls.
I'm reading and I'm thinking about what you're saying, and I'm rereading Yvonne Orr's Dust and her call for us to engage with our trauma, with our history, before we can get to a place where you're able to start again, to start again in the sense that you've dealt with what has happened to you, you've dealt with what's happened in the past, and then there is a new beginning. That she tells the story of how she uses dust, as that book Dust, and the story of this family as a metaphor for how we start again. How do we pull down the old house, if you want to speak, that's falling apart anyway, and then begin again in a new world. And I want to come to that question of how do we come as a consensus, to build consensus. But I think both of you are saying some really interesting things about this need for care, and remembering always that we're dealing with trauma. And often, and I know one day you've written quite a lot about it, there's this way in which we blame each other, especially those people. Look at how badly they're behaving. Look at, whatever, whether it's, from the point of morality, instead of saying that, yes, what they're doing might be something we don't like, but let's look at why. And that doesn't make an excuse for what is happening. It is to say we are all implicated as part of this, and we cannot point fingers. Gala, do you agree or disagree with what we are saying so far? And what would you bring into this question of when we say the soul of a nation, what are we talking about?
There are two things that have been said that sort of really caught my attention, and one by Wandia and the other by Oyunga. I think Oyunga spoke about how the tribe was broken by the experience of colonialism. And Wandia spoke about the inability that we've had culturally to think beyond the family unit. So I don't want to misrepresent those views if this is what I heard. So I disagree with both views. One is because actually the existence of the tribe was the very evidence that people were able to think beyond the family unit, right? So the tribe existing as a kind of moral unit, it is a space in which, and I really don't like to use this term, but it's a space in which people were able to come together and think about the world and think about the universe, right? And impart meaning onto the world, to give themselves names, to give themselves a language, and to give themselves an identity, a realization that without coming together, you could not make sense of your place in the world, but also you could not even conquer, especially the natural world. And to the other point that this thing we call the tribal unit was broken by colonialism. I don't think it was broken. It was redefined. It was reformed. It was the meaning of the tribe took on a different meaning because of colonization. Historians have always spoken about this idea of the super tribe. So when you think about the coming of identities such as the Kalenjin or the Mijikenda or the Luya, these are things that are taking place during the colonial period, and there's a direct relationship between that and the colonial experience itself. Is that people are trying to think differently about identity because of the newness that was brought by the political economy of colonization. Then I would like to throw in this idea of moral ethnicity, which is written extensively about by John Lonsdale, and where he talks about how these communities were all composed with a distinctive ethnic moral language, right? So there was a language, there's a very heavy language of responsibility, there's a very heavy language of civic responsibility, of taking care of each other as people of the same community. You find this not only amongst the Kikuyu imagination, but also the Luo people down the coast, that these ideas of taking care of each other, these are very kind of cherished African values that would be found in most of this kind of ethnic imaginations. What then happens, of course, is that when people begin to meet, and this is a process that was well curated by the colonial state, is that people are beginning to meet from these different communities across the territory in the urban centers, right? So in places like Nairobi, in the civil service, in national schools, is that they already come with a very strong base upon which they think of themselves and they think of their identity. So that the ethnic idiom became strong, in fact, much stronger than this idea that we are all citizens, but in that case, subjects of this colonial state called Kenya. So that in a very interesting way, I think in the way that Kenya develops in the post-colonial period, is that you find very strong ideas around ethnicity. So like you find very, very strong ethnic imaginations, but also at the same time, there's a developing of very specific national Kenyan experiences at the same time. So I think one needs to do a study to this day of how national schools, for example, if at all, shaped a sort of national consciousness, right? what it meant something to have gone to alliance, right? Despite your ethnic background, and a number of schools that we can mention. What does that mean when we think about a national Kenyan experience, right? An experience that is formed, for example, out of these schools. Outsiders looking in, even people from, say, the coast or northeastern, the ability and the idea behind speaking English, for example, also becomes a very nationalizing Kenyan experience in a way that it's not, for example, in Tanzania. And you can add there, trousers, Christianity, right? So these kind of values and these experiences, I think for me, begin to form a certain kind of Kenyan national experience that we have probably not really paid much attention to. But this is not to say that ethnic imaginations existed in opposition to these national experiences. So I think actually in Kenya, what we find is that you have a coexisting of ethnic languages, and in this case, very exclusionary ethnic imaginations coexisting with these very nationalizing Kenyan experiences that are formed by spaces or institutions that we have had to share just on the basis of sharing a territory here called Kenya. So I think we need to think about these other experiences. So it's not, for me, it's not a case of we are doomed to don't have a nation, we don't have any national experience, and ethnicity is kind of the only way in which people can imagine community, can imagine identity. I think that there are many things going on here.
Mm-hmm. And so,
can I just clarify?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
I am not saying that ethnicity is rigid naturally. What I'm saying is that the state makes ethnicity rigid. It's the one that says you can only approach the state as an ethnic group. In fact, actually what the state does, and this is what capitalism does also, it says you cannot enter the political economy except as an identity. And you know why they do that? They do that because identity is given. Usually, an identity is not something I decide. It's decided by where I was born, how I grew up. Those are not decisions I made. I didn't decide that I'm going to be born of the female sex, let me put it that way. So that's why capital likes identities, and it weaponizes identities. And in fact, I would suggest that even right now, they are weaponizing gender more than ethnicity. Because gender, most of us, we come into it having it been decided for us. So what I meant was, what politicians do, it's not what the ethnic group does. What politicians do is that they rigidify our citizenship, and they tell us, you cannot come into citizenship unless you're an ethnic group. So if I want to be as women, look at how women are trying to organize, through the two-thirds gender, and it's a problem. If I try to be any other identity other than ethnic, the state will clamp down on me, will make my life very miserable, and especially when it comes to work, because work is what gives us a sense of self. So they make sure they crush our creativity. They don't give us opportunities to extend our identity through our work. So that, for example, when you let's think of the Makonde. The Makonde came here, they taught us carving skills. Those should be Kenyans by virtue of that skill that they gave us. But no, they must be rigidified and stuck and not allowed to go beyond their identity. Also, we must not assume that our ethnic groups were not mingling before colonialism. They were. And we had different rituals and different ways of interacting with one another. We had names and languages that crossed over our ethnic groups. We are not being allowed that now. So what the problem isn't which identity we are. It's that we are not being allowed to transcend our identities. We're not being allowed to say, I'm ethnic, I'm gender, I am professional, I am this, I am this. All those identities as one, I should be able to bring them into the national space. That's what's being refused by the political class. And for a very simple reason, these guys can't work. Let me just be, crude. They have no skill. They have no work. All they have is access to the state. And many of these families, especially the ones that we started to see coming under this current regime, were families who had grandparents who were colonial chiefs. So it is their access to capital and the colonial state that is making them go ahead. And because they have nothing to contribute to society, they tell us our only access is our identity, because that's what we share with them. If we started to say, what have you done? What ideas have you come up with? What have you created? Where have you gone? They have nothing. And those are the things we Kenyans have across ethnic groups. We can share things we have done together, things we work, we run for this country, we act in movies. There's so many things that we've been doing. But when you look at who makes it to the top, it's not the people who have accomplished. It's the people who were born in the right families. So that's what I meant. I didn't mean that our ethnic groups were rigid. I meant that the state rigidifies them. And when Kenyans start to break out and say, I don't care, we're going to talk about healthcare no matter which ethnic group I come from as a doctor, what happens? You see the politicians coming in and saying, no, this union is being led by a certain ethnic group. They keep us, they refuse to let us transcend our identities. And I don't mean just ethnic. It's across any identity which we didn't have much choice in deciding. That's what politicians go for.
Yeah. So I want us to just, okay, and I love this idea that we are coming to, in addition to everything we've said about the soul, the idea of this evolving meaning, the changing identities, and the idea of communities of belonging. We've talked about ethnic identities, and definitely that's very, very racial, ethnic, tribe, if you want to use that word. All of these, and tribal, will capture both the race and the ethnic thing. But then also you've brought in the identities, other social identities. So communities, communities organized around language, organized, if you want, around faith, professional communities, gendered communities, generational communities. All of these communities are existing in relation to the nation. And actually, nobody is one. I'm not just this, I am this and that and that and that and the other. And what I'm hearing is that there's a way in which the way that those who have access to control over power, state power, to the state, have tended to play one identity against the other, and particularly the idea of this notion of tribe, especially these pre, if you want, 1963 Constitution identities. I want us to come to this idea of the Constitution, because it seems to me that where we're heading to is to say we have a diversity of people, we have a diversity of identities, a diversity of communities. At some point, for whatever reason, we know that in 1920, a century ago, we were brought into an entity called a country, right? A colony at that time that became the country that we know. At some point, we became a republic, we became independent. At some point, we became a republic. We began to work towards this vision of a nation, or we became a nation, depending on where different people are standing. Before we start to get to the thing of the number of questions that are already coming up on the chat, I want us to think about why a constitution matters. Because when we talk about BBI, in the end, it is a contention around a constitution. And not just the 2010 constitution, but the idea of a constitution in relation to Kenya. And I think it's on the table already that not every country and not every nation even has a constitution. I think it's one of the ironies of Kenya that our first constitution that ushered us into independence in 1963 was presided over, the draft was given to us by a country that doesn't really have a written constitution. So I want us to just very quickly, because I want us to get to that question, Gala, that you put on the table of what does all of this have to do with the bread and butter issues, if you want, the Ugali and Sukuma Wiki issues, the problems that people are facing. Take me back, each of you say something about our history of constitutions. And let me just first start with, what's a constitution? What does a constitution have to do with the soul of a nation? What does a constitution have to do with this idea of nationhood? Oyunga, who did I start with? Last time I put Wendy on the spot. So this time, Gala, let me start with you.
Yeah.
Constitution. What's all this about a constitution, the soul of the nation, where we want to go in terms of solving our problems?
So it's important to also pay attention to like the history of constitutional making then in Kenya in particular. One, I always say that the constitution from which much of laws derive from or come from is fundamentally meant to manage relationships. And so therefore, then the question for a particular constitutional experience then becomes, what is the dominant relationship in which that constitution tries to manage? For Kenya and most sort of settler colonies, sometimes we tend to forget that the origins of the Kenyan state were very were based on a patronage relationship, right? So the state was meant to exist so as to advance the interest of a particular class or community within that state's territory. So in this case, white settlers dominated the Kenyan state to advance their interests, throughout the colonial period. And then the problem is that in the 1960s, that system was not fundamentally reformed. The idea that the state exists to serve the sectional interest of a particular class, that idea was not fundamentally sort of disturbed during the constitutional deliberations in the 1960s. Now, as Wandia put it, people had already been socialized to arrive at the state via their identity, right? So that even the sort of discussions that are happening in Lancaster, it was these sort of tribal representatives that had been sent to go and speak on behalf of their so-called, or the ethnicities that they claimed to be representing. And no one seemed to have a problem with that, even during that time, right? So what then happens here is that we pick on a sort of legal framework that was supposed to articulate these very ethnic tribal sentiments, right? So for example, Majimbo then becomes one way in which sort of ethnic fears were being articulated through a constitutional position. In this case, the creation of a quasi-federal state, which is what Kenya becomes independent on in 1963, right? So of course it was very clear that to the Kenyan politician and to the Kenyan public, certain provisions of the constitution were supposed to protect the interests of particular imagined communities, right? Which is to also say that the nation had not emerged, right? And that there was a failure of imagination to imagine the state. You're talking about the post-colonial political elite. And this is sort of the original scene, right? Their failure to imagine the state, their failure to even ask the question, should we imagine a nation called Kenya, right? So that when you talk about laws, you talk about constitution, especially in ways in which the constitution organizes the political space, not so much violence had been done to the idea of ethnic organization. Yeah. And that has been the sort of the political development since then. So when you're thinking about devolution, when you're thinking about creation of the post of prime minister, expanding the executive, it's all just a sort of formalistic language that is being used to express very ethnic motivations in this case. And I think that is actually the tragedy of our history of constitutional making in Kenya.
Thank you, Gala. And I'm going to push back slightly, but let me put that thought there and then go to Oyunga and Wandia and come back, because I think that really important things you've put on the table. Number one, this question of a failure of imagination. I know Marilyn Kamuru said the same in the first webinar. And my question would be, is it a failure of imagination? Is it a limited imagination at that point, people imagined what they could. Remember, they're coming out of colonialism. So you imagine the next thing you can. And then perhaps a little bit later, you want to expand that imagination. The third question I would put into the discussion is who's failing to imagine? Because if I look at, let's say, the process that came up to the constitution we have now, I mean, you go through not just the CKRC draft, the Boma's draft, and all the other drafts, but even if you go through the archives, I mean, the breadth and the richness of the imagination that Kenyans brought to the table is absolutely stunning. And, yes, there was consensus, there was a negotiation that got us where we are in the document that we have, that BBI is now telling us is not enough. But I'm not so sure that Kenyans have a failure of imagination. And I think the problem, I like the idea of imagination. I just want us to think a little bit, I want us to think a little bit more about that. And let me just say, I know the political actors are really important, and we spent a lot of time talking about that in the third webinar. So I know we have to keep bringing them in, but I also don't want to focus on them because I think that's part of the problem of Kenya. We're always centering them in our conversations. So I want us to remember they're there. Let's push them onto the periphery for once and center on our role as Kenyans. All of us who are not political actors, what are we doing? And I also want to put civil society in that discussion, but not center on it, because we really did explore that in the third webinar. I think they're important. I think it's good that we're bringing them in. So I'm not saying don't bring them in, but I also want us to think about us, the rest of us. Wandia Oyunga, who wants to go next? And Gala, feel free to come back to me after this. Wandia Oyunga.
Wandia, if you'll allow me. Yeah. So, yeah, I also got, when Gala mentioned failure of imagination, I realize it's also something I said a lot, about our state of being as a nation. But then, as you talked about it, I started thinking a little bit more deep about it. I realized actually what it is not really a failure of imagination, because one of the things you realize is, if, for example, you're in a position of a curator or somebody who's working with grassroots movements, you realize that half the problem is that those in positions sort of like in positions of power or authority to create change are really bad listeners. So we come with this sort of predetermined solutions, and we're just hoping you'll endorse them. So we're giving you literally it's multiple choice examinations. If you think outside of these three multiple choices that we give you, then there's no conversation. So what I see is a lot of what perhaps I would call a suppression of imagination. And this seems to be almost legislated, almost becomes a matter of policy, is that we just suppress imagination. It becomes just it's almost too radical. It's almost too wild. It's as though you ask a child, what do you want to be? And they say something that's completely out of your scope. And you immediately want to diagnose the child as the child has a problem. What do you mean you want to be a herdsman? That's you're going to private school. Why would that even be an ambition? So I think there's a way, and I'm sorry if I'm going to sort of go back to the point of trauma. I think for me, the reason why we suppress imagination, because that becomes the next question, is that why are we so afraid of this alternative thinking? Why are we so afraid of this we have this sort of grandiose thinking possibilities of how we could be, but every time it comes up, we suppress it. And the suppression has happened so often to the point, and when Andy expresses this frustration quite frequently, the point of you dare speak, and people they call you out. You just imagine, just talking big, like what? Those are just thoughts. You just have ideas. You can just and they made fun of intellectuals for a very long time, or cultural artists. And if anybody ever came up with a grand idea, you just be told those are grand ideas. Be realistic. Vitu kwa ground is different, as we would say in Kenya. So it comes back to that. So this, I'd like to sort of say that perhaps suggest, because this is just an opinion really, that this suppression comes from trauma. And listen, this is my own examination of the problem, because I as you have positioned it for us, is in beyond blaming the politician, beyond saying, okay, these are the problems. We as individual citizens in sort of with interested in sort of creating this sort of change, how can we participate? And in order for me to participate critically within my sphere of influence, at least as a writer and as an editor and a curator, is to fundamentally understand why I keep on stuck in this recurring problem. This idea that if an idea like the elephant, for example, the idea that we could create an independent media platform that's open to all ideas, why is it that at some point we feel a need to suppress it? That we can only expand at this level. And even if we were to imagine ourselves, we can only imagine ourselves in comparison to, say, a Western media platform. The idea that we could be actually the standard of the world in terms of how we do media becomes just something that we almost instinctively suppress. The moment we enter into a world stage, we almost instinctively suppress it. And I think this is just a symptom of trauma, because we have just developed an adaptive behavior where it's almost like a tall poppy syndrome, of where when you get to become almost, you're being too clever. You guys are thinking about things that we always told be realistic. And the school system does that perfectly. They ask you a series of questions. If you break the mold, you're told to come back to operate within the syllabus. There's somebody who was having a discussion here.
Because I don't want to say a lot about what you're saying, because I really agree with you, but I was just trying to remind you of this concept of the ideology of order, which I think has been written about and theorized by Asano Diambo. Maybe to add into your, maybe the origin of this kind of ethos is also from the colonial state. I don't know what you think.
Sorry, just before you do that, Oyunga, come in. Gala, can you just say a little bit more so that everybody's on the same table when you talk about the ideology of order? What do you mean?
So like, because Oyunga is talking really about this kind of Kenyan sense of like not rocking the boat, right? So if you're talking about a settler colony that was ruled by a very few actually privileged elites, right? So actually the question is, how are they able to do that for 75 years to rule over, I think the population of Kenya in 1948 was maybe 4 million. How do you explain how the colonial state survived all those decades? It is sort of like these cultural practices of suppressing imagination, of valorizing order, and of making people to become scared of alternatives, right? So basically, to keep people in their place, and this was made very possible with a state which was basically an alliance of mostly big men, and who chose a very careful reading of culture and tradition to justify most of these cultural practices of not thinking outside the box. There's a very nice academic paper. I always remember the title says, "We've always done it like this, except for a few details," right? So there's also a very careful reading of culture. Don't question, because it has always been done like this. But if you actually look at the history, there are a few details in which things were not as they're being presented. So yes, I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Go ahead, Oyunga.
Yeah, thanks, Gala. Actually, that's a very good. I didn't think of it that way, actually. So thanks. You gave me some more reading there as well. Yeah. So and I see basically suppression comes from, I think if you look at it sort of at an individual level, is that the colonial state became very good at sort of targeting behavior, and there was a way in which they sort of enforced this idea of integration. And if anybody then did not sort of fit within this integration, it's almost like the way they would deal with, you say when they deal with behavioral, they put mice in a cage, and you go towards one end, you want a response, they give you a reward of sugar, and they don't want to go to the other end, they give an electric shock. And if you think about it from in terms of the totality of society, that's exactly what happened. Yeah? Those who tried to go out were just given electric shock for so long. The point of all they had to do was just literally lift up the rod, and everybody stayed in line, and done consistently through very ingenious ways of an education system that we've been unable to basically and basically unravel ourselves from this sort of bind. So at least with that understanding, then perhaps maybe it behooves us then to think of like, what do we do next? You know, how, I mean, beyond just, and because it's very easy to get fixated on the problem, and we can be there for a very long time. You know, is that how then do we teach ourselves and those who come after us to see differently? But more importantly, how do we teach ourselves to heal? Because if we don't particularly heal, then the same sort of traps that brought us to these things are very easy to manipulate. And in a way, sometimes when I look at the way sort of the political class operates in Kenya, it's almost sometimes you think of like a dial. It's like people can just dial it up. You know, it's like people, with society, and Nairobi becomes a perfect example of our stresses are so well organized that somebody can literally just dial it up. All I have to do is just block a certain highway in Nairobi, and I can dial up the stress literally in hours in Nairobi. And there'll be consequences with it. So unless unless we sort of cultivated a committed group of people, I mean, a committed group of people within society, and people at least with that awareness, and encourage them to help us see these problems, to help us see ourselves, because in seeing ourselves, then there's a possibility of actually healing, you know? And as long as we sort of adapt around what is obviously a trauma, carried on, and we can adapt around it, and we do that very well. We can intellectualize it almost to death, you know? But beyond that, you know, we've got to find ways of healing and going beyond it. And it starts, of course, as individual quests, but ultimately, once you're figured out as yourself, it behooves you then to share it. And I guess that's what then centers the culture of movement in this country, in terms of like, what's really going to change us as a people is how we exercise these tools of culture to reimagine ourselves.
Yeah. So I want to ask the same question. I mean, continue the conversation with Wandia, but Wandia, I want to tweak this a little bit. If what Gala and Oyunga are saying is something you don't totally disagree with, arguably, a constitution is that attempt where people get to a place and they say enough is enough, right? Gala, the only, you know, I actually think that when you think about in the greater scheme of things, we were only colonized 1920 to 1960s, 40 years. And somewhere along that place, people said, you know what, we are done. We're not going to agree to this. We're not going to. So there's people somehow imagine it differently. They organize differently. We can go into the nuances of that. There's a constitution, for better or for worse, that governs this new, you know, the new space. We enter into a space of independence in whatever form. And then people start to reform that, you know, they write it and then they say, oh, okay, no. We need to tweak it. And they tweak it and tweak it and tweak it until people say, no, this isn't working. I always say, you know, we usually talk about the journey of constitutionalism. We say the 90s, but, you know, you read Willy Mutunga and we realize actually it began before that with a smaller group of people. But arguably in 1990, we start again as another, you know, and then we go through a journey of 20 years. We come up with another constitution. And now we're just basically looking at it and saying, that looked like a good idea, but some would argue we need to tweak some things about it. And so that's what we are doing. And so it brings us back again to this question. What is a constitution? And in your mind, you know, Oyunga has said, we need to now, we need to leverage the power of culture. We need to do all this so that we can get to a place of constitutionalism. But I guess the counter argument to that, which is what the BBI proponents are giving us, is that, but we don't want to do that until we've got the constitution right? So let's tweak things now so that we don't work on something that we know is already broken. Let's mend it and then work on what Oyunga is asking us to do. So whatever you think of the BBI, is there a merit in that argument? Because at the end, I'm asking the relationship between a constitution and the soul of a nation.
I think the Constitution is sort of like what I was saying. It's our bottom line. You know, what are the basic principles that will guide us? So when one of the major lies about BBI was the idea that the Constitution is responsible for all our problems and they will be solved when we tweak around with the Constitution. And that was not true. I think the question of whether our constitution is perfect or not doesn't arise, because it's people who make things happen. And we all agreed on this document. So what was supposed to have been done was that the politicians were supposed to interpret the spirit of the people that came through the constitution. But what they have done is to fetishize the constitution and make the constitution replace the people. And to say it is only when the constitution is tweaked around and things work, that things will work. They are lying. And this is another problem that we have had with the colonial state. Because what I noticed, something that I learned throughout the BBI discussion, is that anytime the political class, and sorry to say a good section of the middle class, when things are not working as they cannot work with this kind of arrangement, they technologize the problem. They say, oh, the problem is this article, this verse, this chapter, this, they reduce the problem to such a small, manageable thing, and then present it to the Kenyan people and say, the reason devolution is not working is because there's something wrong with the way the constitution assigned assigned resources. But what people were saying is that, no, if you are a real politician who is reading from the spirit of the people, from what the people say they want, then a word of law should not be standing in the way between you and the thing that you need to do as the elected representative. So when the politicians are saying we need to tweak this so that it works, they are fetishizing the constitution. They're making the constitution replace us. And they're refusing to listen to us. And in fact, part of my ambivalence about the court ruling, which I think was a great ruling, was that we had said these things. We had said them in open forum, but the politicians were not willing to listen to the people until it came from a court of law. And they do that because they have masters elsewhere. Their donors are not going to say anything unless it's in a court ruling. Because, the West recognizes courts. But if we say the same thing that the judges are saying, the politicians ignore us because we are not an institution. And for me, that is where the problem is, and it's a problem of imagination and education. We are just not able to go beyond institutions. We're not able to look at issues and see what is the human thing to do? What is the soulful thing to do? Like this case we've been talking about, the children miss a bus and the teacher says, I don't care, go away. And the children trek until, for kilometers and kilometers and they're lost. I mean, what kind of country are we? Do we need the Ministry of Education to write for us a rule about that? About how to treat children humanely when they come late to school? I mean, and this is how, I don't know what the British did to us, but they suppressed our ability to go beyond the rules. We stick to institutions like they are gods. We don't question them. And when somebody says, well, let's imagine beyond the institutions, there are rhetorical ways to make sure that doesn't happen. So you're told, vitu kwa ground ni different, why are you wasting time thinking, does it put food on the table? There are all these rhetorical strategies, or what Keguro Macharia called political vernaculars, that make sure that we never speak beyond the institution. And that's where we have failed. So politicians are lying to us when they say that the issue is the constitution. The issue is them. They lack political imagination. They lack legitimacy among the people. They lack a soul. And so they want to blame the letters of the law for their inability to function. And I also wanted to say that part of this problem comes from the stories we tell about ourselves. For me, when I read the history of Kenya from different places, I'm so amazed by the richness of our history and our resistance. Everywhere in Kenya, there was a major resistance against colonial rule. But those are not the stories we tell. We tell the stories of Kadu crossing the floor, first president, second president statue, and that's the limitation of our history. So because our history is so, our historical consciousness is really, really limited, then we are not able to imagine beyond what the institutions tell us. And that's why, or that is what facilitates politicians to come and tell us, oh no, whatever failures I have, it has nothing to do with my leadership, it has nothing to do with ideas, it has nothing to do with the fact that Kenyans are not allowed to imagine, oh, it's the constitution. And then you know what the media does and the education system, sorry to say, what they do is that they hype up these technological solutions. So we start looking at what we look at the what clause, we start even looking at verbs and pronouns, as we saw during the appeal. We start looking at small technical details, like when we would go to the media, we would be told, no, show us the line, show us where it is written before you can say anything. That limitation of imagination is what facilitates this lie that all our problems can be reduced to the Constitution. I think the Constitution has given us a fairly rigorous framework with which to work with, and we have to do the imagination and say, how do we translate the spirit of what people fought for? How do we translate it into daily life? That requires imagination, and that's what is being fought.
So I'm hearing this, this idea of the limitation of imagination. I love that, Gala, what you brought in, this question of, we're sticking to order and to rules. I think in the last conversation, Daisy Amdani highlighted the fact that, when the Constitution says that 15%, not less than 15% goes to the counties, you don't need to change the Constitution to say now, not less can also mean, as much as 30, right? But we're sticking to the language, to the letter, without allowing ourselves to imagine what are the possibilities beyond this. And I like this idea of this Constitution as an agreement that governs our relationships, a covenant that we have with one another, that before we start to talk about tweaking, first of all, are we even holding on to? Are we even starting? I think that came out of the last conversation. Are we even first doing what we can do with what we have, the agreement that we have, before we amend it? I do want to get to that question of, so what? How does the Constitution, if we allowed ourselves to imagine, we allowed ourselves to think about the lived experience, which is what culture really is, how does that translate into our lives? But before I do that, I want to go to, we've got quite a number of questions that are coming up. I want to ask people to please forgive me if I don't focus on the questions that go over the conversations that we had last time. And so I do see, Michael Omondi, that you've asked us to talk about inclusivity in the BBI. And if we have time at the end of this, we'll come back to that. But really the last conversation, the third conversation, looked at the question of inclusivity at quite some length. So let me put that on the side for now. And I'm going to just look at Babu Ayindo. The first question that is up on the Q&A asks if the panelists in general, do you share Ernest Renan's thesis in the essay entitled, What is a Nation? And he's citing from that particular essay, a nation is a soul, a spiritual principle. And if you share that idea, it is, then what Renan goes on to say is that critical to nation formation is the possession of a common, Therefore, critical to nation formation is the possession in common of a rich legacy of memories. The other is present consent, the desire to live together, the desire to continue to invest in the heritage that we have jointly received, right? So it's a consent, it's an agreement, and then we say, let's continue to share. So I'm going to put that question out there. And then I also want to bring that, Oyunga, if you want to start thinking about that aspect. Babu also asks in connection with that, can a people who are collectively traumatized form a functioning nation? If we share this history, we've agreed to live together, but we've been collectively traumatized. Can we therefore share a functioning nation? Or would we just simply reproduce our trauma in durable governance systems? So what needs to happen? You've talked about us needing to do some things. Do you want to think a little bit further on what needs to happen or change for a traumatized people to form a functioning nation? You've told us we need to do something. Could you think a little bit more about that? So Wandia and Gala, I'm going to ask you to think with Babu on the question of the nation as a soul and as a spiritual principle. Do you agree with that? Do you disagree with that? How would you add to that thought? Gala, can I start?
Yeah, I agree with that. And I agree with Renan's perspective on what a nation is or should be composed by. I think we sort of touched on that at the beginning of this conversation. I also don't feel that throughout our discussion that there's disagreement amongst all of us whether Kenya could be considered as a nation or not. I think we're very clear on these kind of definitions. So then the question becomes, and it's a question I asked initially, is, so if you don't have a nation, so what, right? How do you create a sort of liberal democratic system that creates a very meaningful and functioning concept of citizenship, right? So that despite your identity, you are always assured of your rights as a citizen and as a member of a state called Kenya, right? And I think maybe these are the questions that usually are asked during constitution making processes that maybe in Kenya we have not kind of properly grappled with. The nation as a concept in human history is also not a very old concept as well. So there is no point of fetishizing, if you like, the concept of the nation as if only a nation can function properly as a sort of political community. And to relate that answer to my answer to the next question, which was, can collective trauma create a nation? And say, absolutely. I mean, and not only can collective trauma create a sense of a nation, it can, that nation that's created by collective trauma can also cause trauma as a whole. I mean, I would encourage you to go back to Nazi Germany to look for examples of that. But then again, the question still remains, whether or not we have a nation, how do we conceive of our idea around citizenship? Who is a citizen? Why are they a citizen? And what rights are accorded to them as a citizen? The problem usually arises when some people are denied citizenship rights due to their perceived identities. And this is where this thing always becomes a problem. So how can we imagine a state that serves or can work for all, even in a state where there are multiple nations or multiple ethnicities? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Gala. Wandia, did I hear you starting to come in?
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm also not that attached to a nation. I am attached to humanity. And I feel that's where I feel Kenya has dropped the ball. We just don't relate to each other as human beings. Because when you think of it really, if somebody who is you, if we are saying the Ubuntu, I am because we are, if another Kenyan somewhere in this country is suffering, it should matter to all of us. But that's what we don't have, because we've been told, no, that doesn't matter to you because you're different because of your identity. I think we need to establish our humanity outside of the nation so that the nation becomes the structure where we all respect everybody's dignity and guarantee everybody's dignity within this geographical space we call Kenya. I'm not saying that the nation is not important, but I've reached a point where I'm just like, if we can't even treat each other decently, you know, what nation can we really have? Like, really? And then on the question of trauma, I think, yes, we can become a nation because we are bound by our common trauma. I mean, that's how people find solidarity, by fighting against the same common enemy. And even when you think of cultures and ethnicities, they came together because they had to live in a certain environment. So they are working together to live in that environment, to build a common language, a common history. It brought them together. But I think what is more important is that healing together is what would bind us. If we can just find a way of celebrating each other, celebrating the histories that are still alienated from the national consciousness. I wish we would, you know, have sort of like a circulation of, you know, when we celebrate our national holidays, it's not simply where the president goes, but we say today, this time we're going to do the history of this county. What are the histories there? And we do it for a week, for a month. We keep telling Kenyans, these are the histories from this area. And we do it all, we go all around like that so that we know each other intimately. But it's not even knowing each other, so that it is guiding our national consciousness. What our problem is that whatever makes us social, whatever makes us national, is so controlled. I think it's Oyunga who said, the people in power are just not listening to us, because there are so many good stories about us from different areas of Kenya that never go beyond the county, that never go beyond the belligerent politician, that never reach our history books, that never reach the national holidays. That's what we need to break through, so that we all understand and know one another and celebrate one another. For me, that's what the nation would be. But I feel that part of the problem is that our humanity has been battered. It has been battered by trauma at different levels: the ideological, the spiritual, the educational, and then, of course, the physical, through force of the state. So restoring humanity, for me, is the fundamental thing that we have to do if we want to be a nation.
Wandia, that gives me a good segue to Oyunga. Oyunga, as you when Wandia was speaking, I thought about not just celebrating who we are. I agree with you. There's so many good stories that we just miss out on because we always go back to the same old, but also the stories of pain, the stories of trauma, the stories of hurt, and asking ourselves, what does this really, really mean? Aikwe Ama has a term I go back to all the time, which is called, he uses the term cerebration with an R. And he says that these gatherings should be about us thinking about what does that mean. I remember watching the premiere of Judy Kibinge's film Scarred, which looks at the Wagala massacre. And all of us who were gathered in the space as we were watching it, and people really hearing, before the film, they also had people who are survivors and people from that community coming and speaking about not just what happened, but the impact on them all these years later. And for those of you who don't know the film Scarred, the reason it's called Scarred is that after the Wagala massacre happened, and that we've been talking already about this thing of suppression of people's voices and imagination, people were not allowed to talk about it. And so people had to find underground ways of keeping the memory alive, including songs and other cultural forms of production. But for me, the thing that was most touching was that in that film, you see people bearing their bodies to show you the scars, because that's the only thing they have as evidence that this happened to them. And it was how many of us in that auditorium who are not from that area who said, we did not know. Even when we knew about the Wagala massacre, we had not understood the depth of the trauma and of the pain and how it has continued to be carried on. And people saying, therefore, what does this mean going forward? We cannot just say, okay, now we know, and we'll go home and we'll forget about it. But what does it mean going forward? And I remember someone like Irungu Houghton trying to remind people every year, saying, let's fast on that day. not that my fasting as a person helps those people, but it reminds me of that I need to care about these people and we need to do something about their trauma. So I want, Oyunga, for you to take us into this question of trauma, how it relates to everything we're talking about, and bring in a comment by Kamau Mwiga, who says, let's talk about how emotionally vulnerable, being emotionally vulnerable about our traumas lies outside what is considered proper Kenyan masculinity, or what we like to say to each other, wacha umama. And I want to add that not just in terms of the gendered community, but also how often our faith communities would say, be strong, right? So don't cry, don't show any pain. How often people within, whether, if you're educated, we don't wail and cry at funerals or at events like that. We are strong, going back to that order, the very British stiff upper lip. And how do we get beyond that? How do we deal with this trauma? How does and I'm coming back to that, how does the Constitution, does it help us do that? How do we heal the trauma? Oyunga.
Okay, thanks. There's a lot to unpack there. I think I'll start from what you said towards the end, and given that I came from that space, the emotionally vulnerable man, and it's funny because we're socialized to show strength, so like you must not show any pain, don't cry, don't shed a tear. But then as you get deeper in this work, you start realizing the real strength is actually in being emotionally vulnerable. That's if a Donald Trump could actually say, listen, I was abused as a child, I did not get attention, I need to deal with this. That's where his true strength lies, and this acting up that he did over 4 years in office is literally basically a manifestation of his weakness, of his inability to deal with his past traumas. So in my understanding of trauma, and I sort of settled on trauma in many ways, and Gala said something about the Nazi experience, and when trauma is not dealt with, and we see it with Israel, a nation that was deeply traumatized, doing the exact same thing to a different community. Now, and if we look at Israel as a state and its treatment of the Palestine people, and it's a contradiction that sometimes strikes us as kind of odd, but it's a pattern of what happens when trauma is not dealt with, when trauma is not addressed deeply. And I've learned to sort of see trauma in two ways, and I think this sort of applies to the Kenyan case. There's what we look at as very overt traumas, So, like, for example, what you talk about with the Gala massacre, when you look about the British Gulag, the various things that happened that were just overt, like straight out violence that was imposed upon communities, things in which we can stand today and say, these are our scars. And that is typically how we see trauma. And so, which is why then it becomes very difficult for those who have not actually experienced that level of trauma to associate with it. They find it very hard to sort of create some sense of solidarity. But there's other trauma, and I think which is a little bit more prevalent within our society, which the psychologists, and I got this term from a guy called Gabo Mate, Canadian psychologist, who then called it developmental trauma, of where, as you grow up, and he gives this very good example of as a child, if you're a 4-year-old and you go out in the playground and a bunch of bullies bully you, and hit you up, and you rush home to your mother in this state of distress, and the first thing your mother says is, no, you go out there and be a man, or be strong, or stand up to those bullies, right? So in that immediate moment, what you experience is a loss of vulnerability. What you needed at the time was just to be heard, to be told nothing, just to be allowed to be in that state of distress, that state of pain. But if immediately you're rejected and you're told go off and be something, that becomes a coping mechanism. So that person later in life, even in the deepest of distress, which is why we find in Kenya, you find somebody that just collapsed at work, or somebody developed some cancers, or the manifestation now of we see mental illnesses, right? And these people might not have gone through actual abuse, they might not have been actually beaten by police, but they went through a bunch of developmental traumas that are manifesting much later in life. So I think so when we look at the question of trauma, we tend to then fixate on what becomes an overt trauma. And because of the nature of the trauma, it's so big, it's so ugly, it's so hard to grapple with. The easiest way to do about it is what Kenyans do quite well in our national psychology, where we say accept and move on. Because we just simply don't have the tools to deal with it, and especially as en masse, right? So I think, and I wish I had an easy answer to this, but I think if we come to a fundamental understanding that we're dealing with these two types of traumas, right? And one must not supersede the other. It's not that we should say, okay, the focus should only be on like the big traumas, in the sort of way in which sort of we mirror our experiences to, say, the Black American slavery legacy. Yeah, and we say, okay, we have to find our versions of that level of trauma in order to deal with what we call trauma in our actual nation. But you also accept that a lot of what we are experiencing in our country is just omissions. That you lived in life for so long, you lived to a certain period. The government was supposed to operate to sort of support you in such a way as a citizen, but it did not. And even though the government did directly abuse you, there's certain omissions that have caused such distress in your life, right? And until we get to a point of where we completely, deeply, and fundamentally understand our traumas, and what that first comment said about, it takes us down to a level of almost what Wendy was also talking about, our sense of humanity. Because if we can't go back to this, almost the individual, what's the molecule, the smallest part of, if you don't understand ourselves as individuals, how you've been broken, we can't go beyond this point. And it's the reason why it's not sexy is because it's such slow work. You know, it's not something you can't, the outcome is not guaranteed. It's not, I mean, a constitution, the beauty sometimes of a document is that, you know, you put a constitution, you can have some sort of guarantees. You can put a certain number of days, you can put a number of years. In the next 100 days, this is what we expect. But when you start to do this slow healing work, is that sometimes the outcome is not guaranteed. As any counselor will tell you, you know, the most you can guarantee is just basically time. You have no idea that the patient or the person you're speaking to will have a favorable outcome. But if you show up over and over and over again, and that is the one lesson of parenting, show up over and over and over again, the outcome tends to be favorable. But the actual methodology of the slow work is what we are fundamentally afraid of. So I would think, if I was to even dare suggest a solution, is how we approach stories. And it's the stories that we tell of ourselves, because I think the power really is in the stories. And if we can start to develop a proper treasure trove of stories about ourselves, and I'm not talking about just feel-good stories, I'm not talking about motivational stories in the totality, you know, the good, the bad, and the ugly, you know. If all this could be addressed so that we have the ability, you give people the means to actually see their state of being, then there's the possibility of healing. And at least this would be my contribution as an artist, that we need to go back into curating all the stories, because the stories do exist. You know, I mean, what I love about Kenya, for example, music scene, is that the beauty of the stories there is incredible. A guy like Kitusua, who I think is one of Kenya's most underrated poets. You listen to his music, it's all there. But the thing is that we're not curating it enough in order for it to be shared. And if we do a little bit more of that, I think there's a possibility of us going beyond this stage, of this place where we're stuck, where we think a constitution in its fundamental stuff is the key. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Gala.
And I think also we are not creating these stories also because I think there's a general disrespect of artists and intellectuals in Kenya. And they're never seen as people who can make a proper contribution in a country where the most important contribution or the contributions that are being valued are the ones that lead to sort of a material outcome, right? But you know, and actually this relates to the question of nation making. Nations, if you're to follow Bennett Anderson's theories, that nations are imagined and they are made by intellectuals, thinkers, writers, artists, and creatives and poets. And if those voices or those constituencies are marginalized, then you have this sort of a problem of always rushing back to the constitution, thinking that the constitution is going to create and imagine the nation. But yet those people who actually do that work historically have been marginalized from important spaces in this case.
Thank you, Gala. I'm going to pick a couple of comments that are coming to us and then go back to the questions because it's such a wonderful chat that's going on. I can see Lillian Maura picks up on the idea of culture being the foundation of the nation and speaks to the family, the importance of the family as the fundamental unit of society, according to our constitution. And then she reflects that what is lacking in Kenya is the glue to hold all the communities in Kenya, to really say we are a Kenya nation. So thank you, Lillian, for that comment. Nathan Gumi has reflected at length on what a state is, what a country is, the idea of, and he really wants us to think about the idea of a state having many nations within it. And I think the point has been made that there is no one model of a nation, and even the question of whether we want to have a nation. And at the end of it, he says, the real question is that, if we think of Kenya as a sovereign state that has multiple nations, do these nations share a common objective and hopes? Because if we share a common objective and hope, even if we decide and agree on being several nations that are all governed or are all under one state or are all served by the same state, then we can move forward. And maybe that would be then the role of the constitution. From YouTube, I'm going to just pick a couple of our comments. The Green String Network that works a lot on trauma comments that the intergenerational trauma that you spoke about, Oyunga, continues to haunt us, and says that without social and cultural healing, political reconciliation, which BBI is about, will never work. That we must start with that social and cultural healing. Andrew Minor says that one common thread that's coming through for him through this conversation is an apparent deliberate deprivation of agency of the ordinary person, and that we really need to talk a whole lot more about that. Evelyn Mungao is agreeing with Wandia in particular and says that we need to look at others as humans first and last. Nationhood is fine, but we must ask how our nation or how humanity, how the question of humanity is the basis of these conversations on nation. And thank you for everybody who is saying that, this is a great conversation. I absolutely agree with you. Now, I want us to keep that thought about let's keep the ordinary person at the center of the conversation today, partly because, and I'll put the link on the chat, and at the end, I'll give everybody the links to this. Last time, we really, really focused on the idea of the political actors, on what the political actors are bringing onto the table, what they're saying around this, and how does BBI, the resources that have been spent on BBI, if we just let them all go, right? I mean, we've spent so much, we've invested so much, surely let's harvest something out of that. So, but I do want to just put the two questions that have dealt with that onto the table and ask our panelists to comment really briefly on this, because I do want us to go back to that idea of how does this journey of constitution, this journey of a nation, this journey of a soul, how does that really impact on our everyday lives, on the human beings that we are? But let me just quickly bring onto the table James Njue's question, reflecting on what was said yesterday by a politician, that even if the ruling goes against the BBI initiative, reggae will still continue despite that, right? And he asks, if it does continue, regardless of what is put, whether the ruling says yes or the ruling says no, how does that influence Kenya's future, right? So much, and this is the question on resources. What is our journey towards constitutionalism, regardless of what the judgment is tomorrow? So that's one question. And then the other question is on the place of accountability by the political actors. And what I really like about this question is referring to what Binyavanga Wainaina has talked about in terms of the upright revolution. what would that look like in Kenya? And what are the building blocks, including conversations such as this? So post Friday 20th, 2021, and what the Court of Appeal will say, we have a Kenya. And that Kenya has a constitution, either way, to go and to deal with. How do we move forward? For me, that's what those two questions are asking. Any of you?
Okay, let me start as the cynical one. I think what BBI was about was not really about the constitution. It was about the story. Because I remember asking, and this I want to give a shout out to KOT members because they answered it for me. Because before BBI, the president was violating the constitution in many cases because he could. And then what he would do is present as a done deal, basically saying it's already done, mtadu. And that has been the way he has been operating. He presents us with a done deal, and then people feel, okay, it's too late. We just have to cope with what has been done. So if the president wanted to change whatever, I think he could have done it and would have just told us, you know, bad words came to my mind. But anyway, he would have just told us, you know, go away. But why did he have to change the constitution? Because he needed to break the story that Kenyans have been using. And that is why we are not in a good place where the basic story we have is the constitution. We needed a cultural story, a story of history, a story of our ancestors. And saying we got here because people shed their blood for us to be here. People sacrificed so much for us to have this constitution. We've seen the photos. We know how many people went to dungeons. Others had to leave this country. But those voices were not strong enough for us to say, no, we are not accepting the change of constitution because of what others have done for us before. So we waited until the court case, and that is why politicians are hammering the constitution, because what they want is control of the story. If they break the constitution, what shall we use? And this is where Kenyans, regardless of the ruling, we have to create a story for ourselves, a story of pride in who we are, where we've come from, our scars and our victories, that is too strong that even if we are told, oh, it's clause this, it's chapter this, it's whatever that the politicians tell us, it's not enough to break our resolve and say, you're not going to destroy this constitution. We are the people of Kenya. We are the children of, you know, everyone from Talai clan to Mekatilili to Dedan Kimathi to, you know, Lucas Pikech from Pokot, all those people, Elijah Masinde, we are their children. And as their children, we are not going to accept this. We just don't have that compelling of a story to refuse this. So whatever the ruling is, I think Kenyans need to work on the story. And this is where artists can help us. And I think that is why they are being suppressed. Because the political class knows that if we have a strong cultural story, there's nothing they can do through the constitution. So the reason why they went for the constitution was not simply to change the laws and the clauses and to make things easier. It was to control the story. Kenyans have been challenging this government through the constitution. That's why the political class wants to break it, so that they leave us with nothing on which to fall back on. But also, I know Kenyans don't give up. We don't. We've been here before, we're gonna do it again. Even if the politicians try to get what they want, Kenyans are tough. If we can call Washington and tell IMF to stop giving us loans, just in our Kenya, we'll do this. We are warning politicians. We are tough.
One day, what I'm hearing you say is that regardless of what happens tomorrow, regardless of what the ruling is, Kenyans cannot, even if the ruling says, okay, we're upholding, and so, BBI is quashed, or if the ruling says, actually, they've made some good points, and, I know there are many variations in between, let this go ahead. Kenyans have to remember that Article 3 remains there, right? For now, Article 3 is there. You must defend your constitution. And understanding that the constitution has got rights, it's got responsibilities, it's got, it's got obligations in terms of holding political actors and all public servants to accountability. It's got, people who are worrying about resources. We have got kuna kazi, as you say, kazi kwetu, right? At the end of the day, the guardians of the constitution and what we have imagined for ourselves as a nation has to remain Kenyans. That's what I'm hearing you say. Oyunga Ngala, what are your thoughts?
Gala, if you'll allow me to.
Yes.
I'll try and make it brief. I think one day has summed it up quite well. Huh? Mm-hmm. I wanted to sort of, because one of the things about, I guess, people who speak the language of resistance, and sort of remind Kenyans that no. There's been a long series of resistance, and it's happened in different forms. I think what we're dealing with, especially and this is why the importance of the story is so fundamental, because if there are no stories of resistance over this long time, people just believe that basically they're helpless. And you see one of the responses that you see a lot in our political space is, if, for example, you go on Kenyan Twitter, you're amazed by the amount of trivia that sort of, almost gossip as news that sort of circulates, and just how easily we are provoked to just humor. If we're dealing with the most serious of issues, and just it triggers it, and it's easy to just sort of judge that as, Kenyans are just shallow, But ultimately, what at the depth of it is basically just a coping mechanism, because what happens instead of that level of trauma, the trauma when you have this level of political suppression, when you have a class that's just telling you there's nowhere you're going, mutadu, and so what you're dealing with, that your first response is usually flight, and which is the typical African migrants reality, is just go to a different country that respects you as a citizen, The other option is basically to fight, and if there's only 3 of you fighting in team courage, after a while you start to look like a bit of a crazy. But the most common response that people then turn to is just basically disassociation. You just turn your back on this whole process and just pretend that you tune out of it. So the fundamental issue of story is so important. Because if we're not even telling stories, even the stories of these recent victories that we're having, the stories of just resistance within this decade, the very fact that a process like the BBI could actually be curtailed by just public will, and people just saying no at every level, and people always showing up. There's different forms of resistance, and so we don't get fixated on resistance as only meaning a street protest, or resistance as only meaning some version of an armed struggle, right? The people have to understand that in a situation like this, the only thing that remains is you've got to resist. And especially if you look at it from within a global context of what global capitalism is doing to humanity all around the block, is that people just have to stand up. And it's scary in the beginning, because we always come from the idea that me in my little small pocket, what can I do? Yeah, because you look around and it's suicidal. But if history tells us anything, which is the importance of story, it's always been those 1, 2, 3, 4 brave men and women who bring us to where we are. And so I think that's the spirit that must remain. It's like fundamentally what we have to do is get into basically a resistance mode in any way in which we can sort of articulate this resistance, but we have to resist, in order to basically protect our basic humanity, which then gives our constitution life.
Indeed, Babu Ayindo also says, yes, resistance is our heritage. Resistance is our healing. And he reminds you, Wandia, you once wrote that, and he's agreeing with you. Gala.
Yeah. So yeah, I mean, let's not forget that in large measure, the Kenya 2010 Constitution is a product of almost 2 decades of resistance. And I've said this elsewhere, that this constitution was forced upon this political elite. So it is very obvious and clear that it has now proved to become a nuisance, because it is really reshaping the way in which the executive branch, in particular the presidency, has operated in Kenya since the 1960s. So for me, I've argued this also, that there's a huge shift in which how power operates in Kenya has happened through this new constitution. That is very important to pay particular attention to. But also, thinking about after tomorrow, historically, what we have seen is that the way in which the political elite in Kenya has played around with the constitution is not only to suppress popular voices, but also is to find rules for the game, for themselves, right? So that increasingly, since the 1990s, because the political elite has been fragmenting also, at the center is that they have always struggled to find rules in which they can all agree with, and finding that to be very difficult. So I'm talking about, for example, 1997 IPPG deal. At 2007, there was some form of version of this kind of agreements that didn't actually take place, and this new constitution. So the elite is always finding ways through legal process, through the constitution, to anchor rules of the game, but then finding it very difficult for them to trust each other. And this is how I think this new constitution came to be. I've argued this elsewhere. So this is going to continue to be the case. There's always going to be attempts to change the constitution to fit elite interests. But that is not always the end of the story, as Wandia says. We've been there, we've been here before. To close off, I think I would like to also just sort of emphasize the role of thinkers and artists in this struggle. And I don't know, I mean, for me, I think this is one of the few discussions where I've really had the role of artists and writers and thinkers being centered in sort of political affairs of the country. And I think that, Kitushua, I'm a big fan of him as well. The thing that happens that Kenyan thinkers and writers, even people making memes and jokes on social media, I find are very good at making commentary on the day-to-day, mostly on the social. They give meaning and story to the sort of day-to-day social struggles. The curation, I think, now really needs to happen, with organizations such as the Elephant and others, is how do we then make those debates, those conversations happening online, in music, in writing, important for the future political direction of this country. Yeah. How do we then curate an experience where these cultural producers begin to think also very deeply about serious political questions that this country is facing, so that it's not just a fleeting experience where if a scandal happens, then there's commentary. How can this be turned into a sustained debate, conversation, coming from all quarters, from young people, from poets, from musicians, from writers? How do we make them pay attention to political questions of the country consistently? I think for me, that would be my parting shot.
Whoa, okay, that's a really great thing. We're thinking about the power of imagination, the need for healing, the work of creating the thinking and the action, centering it in ourselves. This work of tending to the soul of the nation, of keeping ourselves, not just resisting for the sake of resisting, but resisting so that we can translate what is in our minds, what we have imagined, these beautiful things we're thinking up into the reality of our lived experience. I really wish we could continue with this conversation. I completely agree with Anastasia Wakonyo, who has said, what a great conversation. This is what we need at the grassroots level, but we really have run out of time. But let me remind you that you can check out the archive of material. There is so much that is on the Elephant, on the Building Bridges initiative. I'm going to come to each of you for a quick last word, 1 sentence, 2 sentences in a minute. But in the meantime, let me just share with everybody that the Elephant has got this amazing archive. There's stuff to listen to, stuff to watch, stuff to read, including the High Court judgment itself. I can assure you that the minute the Court of Appeal judgment has been made public in a form that we can share, we will put it up on that website as well. We have several analyses and of course, all the conversations in this series, including the article by Dr. Kankindi, BBI is dead, Within the Kenyan state that I quoted from earlier. You can find all of this on the website. You can find the conversations as well on the YouTube account. For those of you, I've seen some people asking, the first conversation was on the legal judgment. The second conversation, as we said, was on the question of inclusivity from the point of view of the youth. And the third conversation really focused on the political actors. So please listen to this again, share this with anybody whom you can. This will also be on the same space. And then also keep joining us as we continue to look at not just the question of the BBI initiative and the judgment and the ruling, but everything else, all matters Kenyan and African and the world that we have on our website. I really, really want to thank the panel. So let me come back to you for your last words. Wendy and Joya, thank you so, so much for everything that you have shared. And I will take that idea of resistance with me everywhere we go. Wendy, what is your final word?
I think I just want to assure Kenyans that even with all these struggles, we are a great people. We have made our mark on the world for resisting when nobody thought that Africans could resist. We have always resisted. And no matter what the ruling is, you know, freedom comes from perpetual resistance. So we have to keep resisting. We also must be aware, I think, of the intellectual tools that are used to limit our imagination, be they from religion, from the education system or the schooling system, or from the media. And the vigilance must go there as well. I know words seem not to matter much, but they actually do. And so we must also be vigilant in terms of the stories that we are being told. And let's keep telling our stories. Let's keep working, because we Kenyans work very hard, and let our work be one of the sources of our stories.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Wandi Anjoya is an educationist and public intellectual. Someone corrected me once when I said that, and she said, she's not just a public intellectual, she's the conscience of this nation. And sometimes what she says hurts, but we appreciate it. Thank you, Wandia. Gala Chome. Gala, what you have said, and I really want to thank you for centering the space of the intellectual and reminding us that, you know, these are not disconnected, that this is important, and we must keep making those connections, and we must keep building on that work so that we can translate it into action. Gala, what would your last word be?
Yeah, I think just on that very, very breadth, I come from an academic background as a historian, as an analyst of Kenyan politics. But Grace Musila has written about this, where when it comes to discussion of public affairs and politics in the country, it becomes a very masculine space, and that I think also should be read as part of the problem in terms of all the things we're discussing today. And I think that yes, of course, younger generations have attempted to make contributions, intellectual contributions to serious political questions in the country before, thinking about, ridiculous, for example, the comedy group, but also the intellectuals around Kwani. And I think that seems to have sort of faded. And I think there needs to be a re-energizing of those voices if they're already there, but also of sort of producing these voices, if possible. Where we have more, especially young Kenyans, thinking about the political affairs of the country in very intellectually engaging ways, but also in very innovative and creative ways as well. I think for me, if that happens, then we are looking towards a good political future for Kenya.
Thank you, Daktari. Dr. Gala Chome is, as you've heard, he's a historian, he's an intellectual. He was one of the people who spoke to us on the panel on youth and the politics of inclusivity. Gala, I look so much forward to continuing to being with you in this space. Thank you very much for coming. And my brother, Oyunga. Oyunga has been chief curator of the Elephant. He continues, as I said, to be part of the herd. Oyunga, what is your last word?
Well, I think it's pretty much been said. I'll probably pick up a little bit on what Ngala said towards the end about just centering the place of the artists, and you know, we need to bring them back into the fold. We need to, and it's not a question of waiting for, say, government to. No, it's us, the public, who have to start centering those people. And I mean, we learned about Congolese music from those within our homes. You know, we learned about Franco from those within our homes. So we've got to start centering this voices that exist amongst us. For now, they're on the fringes. They're in places we call the underground, but that's where the truth lives, and we sort of have to basically do our part. The other thing for me is that, and just to pick up from, I guess, the article that inspired this conversation from Antoinette Kankindi, and the story of Cry the Beloved by Alan Payton. There's a line, and she quotes it in an article as well, is that the tragedy is not that things are broken. The tragedy is that things are not being mended again. And I think for me, that's a really important, at least take-home point for me, that it's that almost as a generation, as people of this time and space, as Kenyans or in this space, we've got to do our bit. You know, we just have to put in the work and put in the work in a little small way as much as possible. We need to get out of the idea of, I know we live in a celebrity culture, in a social media culture, with the tendency of grandiose, you know, but I think it's an importance to just go back into, you know, simple work, you know, the collectives that used to come together to collect money in terms of Harambee to send people abroad, you know. We need to do that simple work. We need to do that simple work. We need to do it consistently, and we need to keep doing the work. You know, and yes, the outcomes are great. To be nice to be invested in the outcomes, but what's important is actually the work. And if we continue to do the work, we continue to be inspired by people like Wandia for the kind of work they're doing in the public space. And if more and more people can do that, I think we'll be in a really good place. You know, that will be my bit. Yeah.
Shukran sana. Oyunga Pala is a journalist, he's a cultural critic, and my favorite, he's my fellow storyteller. Thank you so much, Oyunga. We want to very much thank Heinrich-Böll Foundation, who are the partners to the Elephant. We thank the Elephant for the privilege of having us for this conversation. And most of all, we're deeply, deeply appreciative of all of you who have joined us in this webinar, especially for those of you who've asked questions or contributed to the discussion on the chat. We've heard from Garissa, Isiolo, Ruiru, Germany, Nairobi. I know there are many others who have not told us exactly where they're from. Let me borrow from the words of a couple of you. Lilian Maura says, thank you very much to the host and the panelists for a very fruitful discussion. But I really think we did all of this together. So in the words of Anand Mandvani, I just want to say how amazing this conversation this is. Thank you to all of you. We all, I think, will need to go back and listen to it severally to just really absorb it all. We are the Elephant, and our role is to help you think together with you, because we want to speak truth to power. And at the end of the day, power lies with the people. Kazi kwenu.